Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when the vast Mongolian steppes echoed with the hoofbeats of horses and the fierce cries of warriors. It's the early 12th century, and the winds whip through the endless grasslands as a boy named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, takes his first breath under the sky. Born into a world of brutality and struggle, he will rise from the harshest of beginnings to become one of history's most feared and respected leaders. You probably won't survive this. Not without a good dose of luck and skill. But hey, that's the life of a nomadic warrior. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where in the world we're all traveling from tonight. Now, settle in, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Temujin was born into a world of constant conflict. His father, Yasuge, a respected tribal leader, had been poisoned by enemies when Temujin was just a child. With his father's death, Temujin's family was abandoned by their clan, left to fend for themselves on the unforgiving steppes. The harsh winds of the Mongolian plains were not just weathering the landscape, they were stripping away the remnants of Temujin's early comfort, leaving him in a cruel, bare world where survival was a daily battle. From a very young age, Temujin understood the fragility of life. His family, once powerful and revered, was now nothing more than a wandering tribe with no home or support. Temujin's mother, Hoilun, did her best to provide for her children, but the odds were against them. Alone in a wilderness that demanded everything, Temujin's early life was defined by hardship and the deep realization that only strength, perseverance, and alliances could secure a future. Historians still debate how Temujin's early life shaped his leadership style. Was it the brutal nature of his childhood that led to his ruthlessness in later years? Or was it a sense of injustice that propelled him forward? Regardless, this harsh start set the foundation for his fierce determination to never again be weak. It's said that by the time Temujin was a young man, he was already setting himself apart from the other tribal leaders. He began to understand that in order to rule, he would have to do more than just survive. He would have to conquer. As the young Temujin grew, he began to gather followers, but not in the traditional way that Mongol leaders did. Most leaders were born into power, inheriting the loyalty of their father's tribe. Temujin, however, had no such privilege. Instead, he relied on his skill as a warrior and his charisma, attracting men not because they had to follow him, but because they chose to. He began to form his own tribe, based not on bloodlines, but on loyalty and respect. These early followers would prove crucial in his rise to power. Through his early years, Temujin's world was painted in shades of survival, struggle, and loss. Every moment of his youth, whether it was hunting in the rugged steppes or forming early alliances, played a part in shaping the man he would become. A man with a vision for a unified Mongol empire. His early experiences, though grim, would ultimately give him the resilience and ruthlessness necessary to lead the Mongols to greatness. As Temujin grew older, the challenges of his youth evolved into greater ambitions. Now a young adult, he realized that the disunity of the Mongol tribes wasn't just a problem, it was an opportunity. But first, he had to survive the treachery that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His rise to power would be shaped not only by his intelligence and strength, but also by betrayal. And as you follow his journey, you'll see how his leadership would be tested in ways no one could have predicted. Temujin's first great test came when he was captured by the Taichid tribe, one of the tribes that had once been his allies. At this point in his life, he wasn't yet Genghis Khan, just a young man with dreams bigger than the skies above him. The Taichid saw him as a threat to their own dominance, so they tied him up, forced him into slavery, and threw him into a dark cell. Imagine the frustration, the humiliation. A man who had once commanded respect was now reduced to nothing more than a prisoner, reliant on the mercy of those who had once been his comrades. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of this event on Temujin. Some believe it was a catalyst for his later cruelty toward enemies, while others argue that it was this very experience that forged his unshakable resolve and understanding of human nature. One thing is certain, though. After years in captivity, Temujin was freed by a group of loyal followers who had not forgotten his leadership. This moment, marked by his escape, would become one of the defining moments in his life. It would set him on a path of vengeance, not just against the Taiyi but against all who stood in his way. Upon his release, Temujin began to forge a reputation as a man who would not forgive betrayal. His escape, combined with the loyal support of those who believed in him, allowed him to rally his forces. He started to form alliances, not based solely on bloodlines or wealth, but on mutual respect and a sense of loyalty that transcended tribal politics. Temujin's vision for a unified Mongol empire began to take shape, but he knew that he couldn't rely on the traditional methods of tribal warfare. The Mongols needed a new kind of leader, a leader who could bring them together under one banner, regardless of their old alliances. Historians still argue whether Temujin's approach to leadership was truly revolutionary, or if it was simply a natural evolution of the Mongol warrior culture. What is clear is that his military strategy was unlike any the Mongols had seen before. Instead of relying on traditional tribal warfare tactics, Temujin began to assemble his forces with unprecedented discipline and organization. He made his men train together, focus on unity, and operate as a single, cohesive unit. The results were staggering. By the time Temujin had fully escaped his captivity and rebuilt his power base, he had become a force to be reckoned with. His next challenge would be proving to the other Mongol tribes that his leadership was worth following. And to do that, he would have to confront the very men who had once been his enemies, and prove that he was more than just a skilled warrior. He was the future of the Mongol Empire. As Temujin gathered strength and support, his next move was crucial. He needed to challenge the existing order of Mongol tribal leadership. This wasn't going to be a simple battle. It was a battle for legitimacy, a fight for recognition as the Khan of the Mongols. The process of establishing his authority was as much about outsmarting his rivals as it was about defeating them in battle. You can almost imagine the tension in the air as Temujin carefully navigated this phase of his rise to power. One of his first major confrontations came when he faced the tribal leader Jamuka. They had once been close friends and blood brothers, bound by their shared experiences growing up together. But over time, their differences had become impossible to ignore. Jamuka, who held more traditional views on Mongol leadership, saw Temujin's attempts to unify the Mongol tribes as a threat to his own authority. Jamuka represented the old guard, a system where loyalty was based on noble bloodlines, and traditions that Temujin was determined to break. The conflict between Temujin and Jamuka escalated quickly. Historians still debate whether the battle that followed was a turning point for Temujin, but it certainly marked a pivotal moment. In 1187, the two clashed in the Battle of Dalan Baljut. The battle was fierce, and despite Temujin's well-disciplined forces, Jamuka's larger army emerged victorious. Temujin was defeated, but this loss did not break him. Instead, it fueled his determination to push forward and proved that his vision for the Mongols was far greater than the traditional tribal system. After the battle, a notorious act took place that marked the cruelty of the times. Jamuka, after his victory, captured 70 of Temujin's soldiers and had them executed in a brutal manner, boiling them alive in cauldrons. This act horrified even Jamuka's own followers and served as a stark contrast to Temujin's philosophy. Temujin, in his grief, vowed to never be like Jamuka. Instead of resorting to such horrific measures, he would build his power with the loyalty and respect of his followers. A loyalty that would be earned through merit, not birthright. This event, horrific as it was, played a critical role in shaping Temujin's reputation. He began to gain followers not because of his bloodline, but because of his belief in merit and ability. His treatment of captives and his respectful leadership philosophy began to differentiate him from Jamuka and other Mongol leaders. Temujin's growing charisma and strategic brilliance attracted men from all corners of the Mongol steppe. Men who had once sworn allegiance to Jamukha began to switch sides, drawn by Temujin's vision for a united Mongol nation. Historians still debate whether this moral high ground, in the face of brutal tribal politics, made Temujin more respected or feared by his followers. Some suggest that his strict codes of discipline and loyalty earned him unwavering support, while others argue that it was the fear of his eventual vengeance that drove many to follow him. Either way, the brutality of the battlefield and the philosophical divide between the two men would define the next stages of Temujin's rise. Despite his initial defeat, Temujin did not back down. Over the next few years, he reorganized his forces, carefully choosing his battles and building alliances with other tribes. He also began to establish himself as a leader who valued the individual merit of his warriors above their tribal affiliations. This shift in leadership would help him solidify his control over the Mongols and lay the groundwork for his ultimate success. In 1206, after years of warfare, diplomacy, and strategy, Temujin finally achieved his goal. He was declared Genghis Khan, the universal ruler of all the Mongols. This title was not just a recognition of his power. It was a symbol of his ability to unify the Mongol tribes under one banner, to bring them together in a way no leader before him had done. The title of Khan carried with it both immense respect and the heavy burden of leadership. Genghis Khan now stood as the ruler of a united Mongol empire, and the world would soon feel the consequences of his unification. Historians still argue about the significance of the title Genghis Khan. Some see it as a symbol of his military genius, while others view it as the beginning of a new chapter in Mongol society, one that was more organized, structured, and efficient than ever before. What is undeniable is that Genghis Khan's rise to power was not just about conquering land. It was about redefining the very concept of leadership within the Mongol world. With the title of Genghis Khan firmly in his grasp, a new chapter in the Mongol Empire began to unfold. The title was more than just a symbol of power. It was a declaration of his ability to unite disparate tribes and peoples under one rule. His leadership was not merely about strength and tactics, but also about vision. Genghis Khan knew that to build a lasting empire, he needed to create a unified system, one that transcended the old tribal divisions and instead focused on loyalty, merit, and efficiency. Immediately upon assuming the title, Genghis Khan set about reforming the Mongol military. His greatest strength lay in his ability to organize and train his forces in ways that made them incredibly effective. Gone were the days when the Mongol army was composed of loosely organized raiders. Genghis Khan instilled discipline, coordination, and advanced tactics, transforming his warriors into a highly trained and mobile force that could strike swiftly and decisively. He also introduced new military units, such as the Tumen, groups of 10,000 soldiers, each one trained to move as a single, coordinated unit. One of the most remarkable aspects of Genghis Khan's army was its reliance on the bow. Mongol archers, renowned for their skill, were capable of shooting accurately while riding at full gallop. This made the Mongol cavalry an unstoppable force on the battlefield. Historians still marvel at how Genghis Khan was able to create such a highly skilled and disciplined military force from the nomadic Mongol tribes. Some suggest it was his keen understanding of the natural world, his knowledge of the terrain, and his ability to read the land that gave him the edge over his enemies. Others argue that it was his sheer willpower and leadership that forged the Mongol military into a force capable of dominating vast expanses of territory. Yet, Genghis Khan was not only a conqueror, he was also a brilliant strategist who understood the importance of psychological warfare. His reputation for ruthlessness often preceded him, and he used fear to his advantage. The mere mention of Genghis Khan's name was enough to send enemies into a panic, and his enemies were often so terrified that they would surrender without a fight. Historians still argue whether this fear was a key component of Genghis Khan's success, or if it was his military innovation that truly set him apart from other rulers. But while Genghis Khan's reputation for brutality was well earned, he also demonstrated remarkable tolerance and understanding when it came to governance. One of his first acts as ruler was to adopt a legal code known as the Yasa. This code was an attempt to bring order and justice to the Mongol Empire, which had been plagued by lawlessness in the past. The Yasa was strict but fair, and it emphasized loyalty to the Khan, the importance of military discipline, and the respect for trade and commerce. Under Genghis Khan's rule, the Mongol Empire became a place where trade could flourish, and where even those from conquered lands were often allowed to continue their lives as they had before, so long as they swore allegiance to the Khan.
Genghis Khan's policies regarding trade were particularly forward-thinking.
He understood the importance of maintaining trade routes, especially those along the Silk Road. By ensuring the safety of merchants and travelers, Genghis Khan was able to facilitate the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies between the East and the West. The Mongol Empire, under his rule, became a bridge between civilizations. Merchants, scholars, and even diplomats from far-flung regions of the world, China, Persia, Europe, and beyond, found themselves traveling the Silk Road with relative safety, thanks to the Khan's military protection.
As the empire grew, Genghis Khan's vision for a world interconnected by trade and ideas began to take shape. He encouraged the exchange of knowledge, particularly in the fields of science, mathematics, and astronomy. The Mongol Empire was, for a time, a place where scholars from different cultures could come together and share their knowledge. Genghis Khan understood that the true strength of his empire would not come from sheer military might alone, but from the ability to build a civilization that valued learning, culture, and innovation. Historians still debate the full extent of Genghis Khan's influence on the cultural exchanges that took place along the Silk Road. Some suggest that his tolerance and encouragement of trade helped to facilitate the spread of ideas and technologies, while others believe that the true impact of the Mongol Empire's cultural exchange was only fully realized after Genghis Khan's death. Regardless, it is clear that Genghis Khan's policies had a lasting effect on the flow of goods and ideas, and the empire he built laid the foundation for a global exchange that would continue for centuries.
One of the more intriguing aspects of Genghis Khan's reign was his ability to incorporate foreigners into his administration. Many of his key generals, advisors, and officials were not Mongol by birth. Genghis Khan was known to value skill and loyalty above all else, and he surrounded himself with talented individuals from various cultures. This inclusivity helped to create a diverse and adaptable ruling class that could navigate the complexities of the vast empire Genghis Khan had built. His ability to integrate different peoples into his administration played a crucial role in the longevity of the Mongol Empire, as it allowed him to effectively govern the many different regions and peoples under his control. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's open-minded approach to governance was the key to his success, or whether it was his military prowess that allowed him to maintain such a vast empire. Some suggest that Genghis Khan's ability to adapt to different cultures and incorporate diverse ideas helped him maintain control over his empire, while others argue that his success was more the result of his military innovations and ruthless tactics.
As Genghis Khan expanded his empire, he set his sights on the rich and powerful Khwarezmian Empire, which stood between him and his ultimate goal of dominating the Middle East. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire would prove to be one of the most devastating campaigns of Genghis Khan's career. Historians still debate the reasons behind Genghis Khan's invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. Some argue that it was a matter of revenge for the slaughter of his ambassadors, while others suggest that Genghis Khan's desire for control over the Silk Road trade routes was the driving force. Regardless of the reasons, Genghis Khan's forces wreaked havoc on the Khwarezmian Empire, eventually bringing it to its knees. The invasion marked one of the bloodiest chapters in Genghis Khan's reign, and it demonstrated just how far he was willing to go to achieve his vision of a unified, global empire. After the brutal conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan's empire reached its peak in terms of both territorial extent and influence. His name had become synonymous with unstoppable force, a ruler whose military campaigns carved new borders into the map of the world. But the question arises, how much of Genghis Khan's success was based on sheer military might, and how much was due to his ability to govern and create a lasting legacy? The answer lies in his keen political instincts and his ability to adapt to ever-changing circumstances. As Genghis Khan's empire grew, he faced the challenge of maintaining control over vast swaths of land
and a diverse range of cultures. The Mongol Empire stretched across the steppes of Mongolia, the plains of Central Asia, and deep into China, Persia, and Eastern Europe. Each region had its own customs, languages, and systems of governance. The empire needed more than just a strong military leader. It needed a ruler who could bind these different peoples together into a cohesive whole. One of the most remarkable aspects of Genghis Khan's reign was his ability to consolidate power and maintain unity across such a diverse empire. Despite the cultural differences and historical divisions between the various peoples under his rule, Genghis Khan was able to foster a sense of shared purpose. He accomplished this not just through force, but through the application of legal reforms, a solid administrative structure, and, perhaps most importantly, by promoting a sense of Mongol identity. To this end, Genghis Khan introduced the Yasa, a legal code that applied to all subjects of the empire, regardless of their origin. The Yasa was a set of strict laws that emphasized loyalty to the Khan, discipline, and respect for authority. It also encouraged the Mongols to live up to the standards of integrity, honesty, and honor that Genghis Khan himself upheld. The Yasa was one of the many tools Genghis Khan used to enforce his rule and maintain order across his vast empire. Some historians argue that the Yasa was instrumental in keeping his empire unified, as it provided a common set of rules for people from many different cultures to follow. Others believe that it was simply another way to instill fear and ensure that subjects adhered to his will. Historians still debate the true significance of the Yasa. Some view it as a brilliant tool of governance that helped Genghis Khan manage a vast and diverse empire, while others suggest that its authoritarian nature undermined the very cultures it sought to control. Regardless of its exact impact, there's no doubt that Genghis Khan's legal reforms helped him maintain control and bring order to a vast empire that stretched across 3 continents. As the Mongol Empire grew, so did the challenges it faced. Despite Genghis Khan's best efforts, he was not invincible, and his empire was far from stable. The harsh realities of his military campaigns, combined with the complexity of managing such a vast empire, began to take a toll. Yet, it's precisely in the face of these challenges that Genghis Khan's leadership proved most remarkable. He was not just a warrior. He was also a master of politics, a ruler who understood the importance of alliances and diplomacy. One of the most significant political maneuvers Genghis Khan made during this period was his alliance with the Jin dynasty in northern China. While the Jin dynasty had once been a powerful force in the region, Genghis Khan saw an opportunity to strike a deal that would benefit both sides. By offering his support to the Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan was able to secure valuable resources, including military reinforcements, while simultaneously weakening his rivals. This alliance played a crucial role in his campaign against the Jin dynasty, which would eventually fall to the Mongols in 1234. But Genghis Khan's diplomacy didn't stop at his relationship with the Jin dynasty. He also cultivated alliances with several Central Asian and Persian kingdoms, who saw the Mongol Empire as a necessary partner for their own survival. Some of these alliances were forged through marriages, as Genghis Khan sought to expand his influence through strategic family connections. These diplomatic marriages, often to daughters of defeated kings, helped to solidify his rule and increase his power. Historians still debate the role that Genghis Khan's alliances played in his conquests. Some believe that his diplomatic skills were just as important as his military prowess, while others argue that his success was largely due to his unmatched ability to organize and lead his army. Whatever the case, it is clear that Genghis Khan's diplomatic acumen helped him to establish a far-reaching network of allies that contributed to the expansion of his empire. Yet, despite his many successes, Genghis Khan was not content to rest on his laurels. In the years following the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan focused his attention on the western territories of the empire, seeking to extend his influence into Persia, the Middle East, and even Europe. His desire to expand the Mongol Empire was driven not only by the need for new territories and resources, but also by his ambition to create a unified world under Mongol rule. Historians often debate the reasons behind Genghis Khan's seemingly insatiable desire for conquest.
Some suggest that he sought revenge for the wrongs done to his family and people, while others argue that his vision of empire was motivated by a deep sense of personal ambition. Regardless of the underlying reasons, Genghis Khan's conquests had a profound impact on the course of history, and his military campaigns would continue to shape the world long after his death. One of the most fascinating aspects of Genghis Khan's empire was the way he utilized the resources and infrastructure of the lands he conquered. He didn't just plunder his enemies, he also sought to incorporate them into the Mongol system, integrating their people, technologies, and cultures into the greater Mongol Empire. This integration allowed the Mongols to maintain a degree of control over vast territories while also encouraging the exchange of ideas, technologies, and goods. It's this unique blending of cultures and peoples that allowed the Mongol Empire to remain strong and resilient in the face of challenges. Historians still debate whether Genghis Khan's approach to conquest was truly innovative, or if it was simply an extension of traditional Mongol nomadic practices. Some argue that he was ahead of his time, creating a sophisticated system of governance that combined military might with cultural exchange. Others suggest that Genghis Khan's empire was built on the exploitation of conquered peoples, and that his policies were little more than a reflection of the brutal realities of the nomadic lifestyle. Regardless of how historians view his methods, there is no doubt that Genghis Khan's empire changed the course of history in ways that no one could have predicted. As the Mongol Empire continued to expand under Genghis Khan's leadership, the world began to witness the power of his empire's reach and influence. The magnitude of his conquest was unprecedented, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of Europe, from the vast deserts of Persia to the mountains of the Himalayas. Genghis Khan's empire became not just a political entity, but a cultural and economic powerhouse, creating connections between the East and West that would shape the course of history for centuries. One of the most remarkable aspects of Genghis Khan's rule was his ability to govern such a vast and diverse empire. At its height, the Mongol Empire encompassed much of Asia, parts of Europe, and even stretched into the Middle East. The challenge of ruling over such a sprawling territory was immense, with different regions, peoples, and cultures all coming under his control. Yet, Genghis Khan's political strategies allowed him to manage this complexity with remarkable efficiency. Historians still debate the extent to which Genghis Khan's leadership was guided by a clear vision, or whether it was the result of circumstances and opportunities. Some believe that his rise to power was fueled by a deeply personal sense of revenge against those who had wronged him and his family. Others argue that his conquests were driven by a desire to create a unified empire that would stand the test of time. But no matter the motivations, it is clear that Genghis Khan's leadership was both ruthless and visionary, shaping the course of history in ways that no one could have predicted. Genghis Khan's ability to govern his vast empire was not simply a matter of military prowess. It also required a deep understanding of governance, diplomacy, and culture. As the Mongol Empire expanded, Genghis Khan sought to integrate the diverse cultures and peoples he conquered into his empire, blending traditions and ideas from East and West. This cultural exchange played a significant role in the empire's stability, as it allowed for the free flow of knowledge, ideas, and technology between different regions. One of the key elements of Genghis Khan's governance was his ability to promote meritocracy. Unlike many other rulers of his time, Genghis Khan rewarded those who proved their worth through skill and loyalty, regardless of their social class or background. This approach helped to create a highly capable and loyal administration, with individuals from all walks of life rising through the ranks based on their abilities rather than their lineage. This meritocratic system was a key factor in the success of the Mongol Empire, as it ensured that capable individuals were in positions of power and influence, regardless of their ethnicity or origin. Historians still argue over the long-term effects of Genghis Khan's meritocratic system. Some believe that it was a revolutionary approach to governance, one that allowed for the creation of a highly efficient empire. Others argue that while the system was effective in the short term, it ultimately led to instability and fragmentation after Genghis Khan's death.
as his successors struggled to maintain the same level of merit-based leadership. Despite these debates, it is clear that Genghis Khan's leadership style was unique in its emphasis on loyalty, competence, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As the Mongol Empire expanded, Genghis Khan continued to make strategic alliances with neighboring empires and states, ensuring that his empire remained strong and stable. One of the most important alliances he forged was with the Western Xia dynasty, a powerful state in northern China. This alliance allowed Genghis Khan to consolidate his power in the region and create a buffer between his empire and the growing threat of the Jin dynasty. Through a series of diplomatic negotiations and military campaigns, Genghis Khan was able to secure his borders and strengthen his position in the region. Historians still debate the significance of Genghis Khan's diplomatic efforts. Some view his alliances as a clever strategy to secure his empire's borders and expand his influence, while others suggest that his alliances were simply a way to delay conflict until the right moment. Regardless of the motivations behind his alliances, it is clear that Genghis Khan's diplomacy played a crucial role in the success of his empire. His ability to navigate the complex web of relationships between different states and empires allowed him to maintain peace and stability within his own borders, while expanding his influence abroad. The Mongol Empire's success was also due in large part to Genghis Khan's military innovations. His armies were renowned for their speed, discipline, and ability to adapt to different environments and conditions. Genghis Khan's military strategy relied heavily on the use of cavalry, particularly his elite horse archers, who could strike quickly and retreat before the enemy could respond. This tactic allowed the Mongols to overwhelm much larger and more technologically advanced armies, often defeating their enemies with minimal losses. Historians still argue over the exact reasons for the Mongols' military superiority. Some suggest that it was the result of their innovative tactics and discipline, while others argue that it was the Mongols' ability to learn from their enemies and adopt new technologies and strategies that gave them an edge. Regardless of the reasons behind their success, the Mongols' military prowess was a key factor in their ability to conquer such vast territories and maintain control over such a diverse empire. As Genghis Khan's empire expanded, it became clear that he was not content with simply conquering new lands. He sought to create a lasting legacy, one that would ensure the survival of his empire long after his death. To this end, he made significant efforts to establish a system of governance that would endure, focusing on creating a stable and effective administration. His policies, including the promotion of trade, the protection of merchants, and the establishment of a unified legal system, helped to ensure that his empire would remain strong for generations to come. Historians still debate the long-term impact of Genghis Khan's policies. Some argue that his administrative reforms were a key factor in the Mongol Empire's success, while others suggest that his empire's ultimate collapse was the result of his inability to maintain control over such a vast and diverse territory. Regardless of the cause, Genghis Khan's legacy endures, and his impact on world history is still felt today. As Genghis Khan's empire continued to expand, so did his influence over the cultures and peoples within it. His empire became not only a political and military force, but a cultural and intellectual crossroads between East and West. The Mongols, often seen as brutal conquerors, were also responsible for one of the most remarkable periods of cultural exchange in history. This exchange of ideas, art, and technology left a lasting mark on the civilizations that came into contact with the Mongols, transforming the cultural landscape of Eurasia. One of the most significant impacts of Genghis Khan's empire was the movement of people. His conquest created a network of trade routes that spanned from China to the Middle East and Europe, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas across vast distances. Merchants, scholars, and artisans traveled along these routes, bringing with them new technologies, philosophies, and artistic styles. These exchanges helped to shape the cultures of the societies that participated in the Silk Roads, blending elements from different regions into new and innovative forms. Historians still debate the extent to which the Mongol Empire was responsible for the cultural flourishing that occurred during their rule. Some argue that the Mongols were merely the facilitators of this exchange, while others suggest that their policies directly encouraged the movement of ideas and people. Regardless of the cause, it is clear that the Mongol Empire played a key role in fostering cultural connections between the East and West, influencing everything from art to science to philosophy. One of the most enduring legacies of the Mongol Empire was the spread of scientific knowledge. Scholars from across the empire gathered in cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Beijing, exchanging ideas and knowledge on a variety of subjects. The Mongols were particularly interested in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and their patronage of scholars helped to preserve and expand upon the knowledge of earlier civilizations. In many ways, the Mongol Empire acted as a bridge between the Islamic Golden Age and the Renaissance in Europe, transmitting ideas and discoveries that would later shape the course of Western thought. Historians still debate the role of the Mongols in the transmission of knowledge. Some argue that the Mongols were merely passive recipients of intellectual achievements, while others suggest that their policies actively encouraged the spread of scientific ideas. Regardless of the debate, it is clear that the Mongol Empire played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge, particularly during the early stages of their rule, when they controlled vast portions of the world's intellectual centers. Alongside the scientific exchange, Genghis Khan's empire also saw the development of a unique form of cultural synthesis. As the Mongols conquered new territories, they adopted and adapted the cultures they encountered. The Mongols were particularly interested in the art and architecture of the societies they conquered, incorporating elements of Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian styles into their own artistic traditions. This cultural fusion is evident in the art and architecture of the Mongol period, which blended various influences to create a distinctive and innovative style. Historians still argue whether the Mongols were truly responsible for this cultural fusion, or whether it was the result of the cultures themselves blending over time. Some scholars argue that the Mongols simply appropriated the artistic traditions of the societies they conquered, while others suggest that the Mongols actively encouraged the blending of artistic styles. Regardless of the debate, it is clear that the Mongols played a key role in shaping the cultural landscape of their empire, creating a unique and vibrant artistic tradition that still influences the region today. The Mongol Empire's cultural exchange was not limited to art and science. It also extended to religion. One of the most significant religious developments during this period was the spread of Islam into Central Asia and China. The Mongols, despite their own shamanistic beliefs, were generally tolerant of different religions and allowed their subjects to practice their faiths freely. As a result, Islam, along with other religions such as Buddhism and Christianity, began to spread along the trade routes of the empire, reaching new regions and influencing the cultures of the Mongol-controlled territories. Historians still debate the role of Genghis Khan's empire in the spread of Islam. Some argue that the Mongols played a direct role in the expansion of the faith, while others suggest that Islam would have spread to these regions regardless of Mongol rule. Regardless of the cause, it is clear that the Mongols played a significant role in facilitating the spread of religious ideas across their empire, helping to create a diverse and religiously tolerant society. As Genghis Khan's empire continued to grow, so did his power and influence. He was no longer just a ruler of Mongolia. He had become the ruler of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. The reach of his empire extended far beyond the steppes, encompassing parts of China, Persia, and Eastern Europe. His conquest had created a new world order, one in which the Mongols were the dominant power in Eurasia. And yet, despite his overwhelming success, Genghis Khan was keenly aware of the fragility of his empire. The vastness of his empire made it difficult to govern effectively, and he knew that in order to secure his legacy, he would need to create a system of governance that could withstand the test of time. Historians still debate whether Genghis Khan's empire was truly a unified entity, or whether it was more of a collection of loosely connected regions. Some argue that the Mongols imposed their own system of governance on the territories they conquered, while others suggest that the empire was more decentralized, with local rulers maintaining significant autonomy. Regardless of the structure, it is clear that Genghis Khan's empire was a formidable force that had a lasting impact on the political landscape of Eurasia.
Genghis Khan's rule was characterized by a unique blend of military might, political acumen, and cultural exchange. His empire was built not only on the strength of his army, but also on the strength of his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. His approach to governance, his promotion of meritocracy, and his cultural openness helped to create an empire that was both resilient and innovative. It is this combination of factors that allowed Genghis Khan to create an empire that would endure for centuries, shaping the history of the world long after his death. As Genghis Khan's empire flourished, so did the complexities of his leadership. His role as a military genius, and his unmatched ability to unify disparate tribes into a single, unstoppable force were key to his success. But beneath the surface of his brutal conquests, Genghis Khan also demonstrated a deep understanding of governance, law, and human nature. He knew that to sustain his empire, he would need more than just a powerful army. He would need a unified legal system, efficient administration, and a way to integrate the diverse cultures within his vast empire. One of the most significant accomplishments of Genghis Khan was the creation of the Yasa, a code of laws that governed not only the Mongol people, but also the subjects of the territories he had conquered. The Yasa was not just a legal framework for crime and punishment. It was a reflection of Genghis Khan's vision of an empire that was unified by a common set of principles. The laws were strict and often harsh, but they were also designed to create order and stability in a vast and diverse empire. The Yasa helped to bring a sense of consistency to the administration of Genghis Khan's territories, ensuring that justice was applied evenly across his empire, from the steppes of Mongolia to the streets of Baghdad. Historians still debate the specifics of the Yasa and its true influence on the Mongol Empire. Some argue that it was a code of laws that served to centralize power in the hands of the Mongol rulers, while others suggest that it was a pragmatic system designed to ensure the loyalty of the diverse peoples under Mongol rule. Regardless of the interpretation, it is clear that the Yasa played a crucial role in the success of Genghis Khan's empire, providing the legal and moral foundation upon which the Mongols could build their empire. Beyond law and governance, Genghis Khan's success also hinged on his ability to build an efficient and effective administration. He was a master at delegating authority and recognizing talent, regardless of a person's background or ethnicity. His meritocratic system allowed individuals from all walks of life to rise through the ranks, based on their abilities rather than their social status. This approach not only helped to strengthen the Mongol Empire, but also allowed Genghis Khan to foster loyalty among his followers. His officers, generals, and administrators were not just his subordinates. They were his partners in the creation of an empire. Historians still debate whether Genghis Khan's meritocracy was truly a revolutionary concept, or whether it was a practical necessity for the Mongol Empire. Some argue that his system was groundbreaking, as it broke with traditional feudal structures and allowed for a more flexible and dynamic government. Others suggest that it was simply a pragmatic response to the challenges of ruling an empire of such vast diversity. Regardless of the interpretation, the fact remains that Genghis Khan's meritocratic system was one of the key factors that allowed him to govern his empire effectively, maintaining the loyalty of his subjects and securing the long-term stability of the Mongol state. As Genghis Khan consolidated power within his empire, he also recognized the importance of establishing strong diplomatic relations with other powers. While his military campaigns were often violent and devastating, Genghis Khan was also a shrewd diplomat who understood the value of alliances. His approach to diplomacy was pragmatic. He often used marriage, trade, and strategic alliances to strengthen his empire's position. By fostering diplomatic relations with neighboring states, he was able to secure the borders of his empire and create a network of allies that helped to maintain Mongol power across Eurasia. Historians still argue over the extent to which Genghis Khan's diplomatic strategies contributed to the stability of his empire.
Some scholars emphasize the importance of his alliances, suggesting that his diplomatic efforts helped to reduce the need for constant warfare. Others argue that Genghis Khan's military successes were far more important than his diplomatic strategies, and that his empire's stability was ultimately maintained through sheer military might. Regardless of the debate, it is clear that Genghis Khan's diplomatic acumen played a key role in shaping the success of his empire. The legacy of Genghis Khan's empire is often seen through the lens of his military campaigns, but his contributions to the development of law, governance, and diplomacy are just as significant. His ability to adapt to the complexities of empire building and his understanding of human nature allowed him to create a legacy that would endure for centuries. The empire he founded may have fragmented after his death, but the principles he established, meritocracy, legal consistency, and diplomatic savvy, continued to influence the course of history long after his passing. Historians still debate the ultimate impact of Genghis Khan's leadership. Some see him as a ruthless conqueror who brought devastation to large parts of the world, while others view him as a visionary ruler who created one of the most successful empires in history. What is undeniable is that Genghis Khan's leadership transformed the world in profound ways. He united disparate tribes, built a vast and powerful empire, and left a legacy that continues to shape the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia to this day. As Genghis Khan's empire expanded, his focus shifted from mere conquest to consolidation, aiming to secure his vast holdings and ensure their long-term stability. He had built an empire the likes of which had never been seen, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of China, and from the mountains of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. But this was no easy feat, and Genghis Khan knew that the empire's success would depend not only on military might, but also on the strength of its infrastructure and its ability to integrate diverse cultures and societies. One of Genghis Khan's key strategies for securing his empire was the creation of a unified, efficient communication system. He understood that in order to control such a vast territory, he needed to ensure that information could travel quickly across his empire. To achieve this, Genghis Khan established a series of relay stations known as the Yam, which were essentially a network of mounted couriers and way stations that could deliver messages at incredible speed. The Yam system allowed Genghis Khan to maintain direct control over his empire, even over the most distant provinces. Historians still debate the extent to which the Yam system was truly a revolutionary concept, or simply a natural progression of the Mongol military infrastructure. Some scholars argue that it was one of the key innovations that enabled Genghis Khan to govern such a vast empire, while others point out that similar systems had been used by other empires before. Regardless of the specifics, it is clear that the Yam system played a crucial role in the smooth functioning of the Mongol Empire. It facilitated not just the movement of military intelligence, but also trade, diplomacy, and the movement of goods, ensuring that Genghis Khan's empire remained connected, even across the most remote and rugged regions. Alongside the Yam system, Genghis Khan also recognized the importance of trade and commerce in sustaining his empire. Though he was a conqueror, he understood that the strength of his empire depended not only on military conquest, but also on economic prosperity. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were also merchants, and Genghis Khan's empire was built on the foundation of trade. Under his rule, the Silk Roads, those ancient trade routes that connected the East and West, flourished once more. The Mongols made the Silk Road safer for merchants, and as a result, trade between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia expanded dramatically. Historians still debate the role that trade played in the success of the Mongol Empire. Some argue that Genghis Khan's ability to secure the trade routes was key to the empire's wealth and stability, while others suggest that military conquest and the subjugation of other peoples were the primary drivers of the Mongols' success. Either way, it is undeniable that Genghis Khan's focus on trade helped to ensure that his empire remained economically vibrant, providing the resources necessary to maintain his army and fund further conquests. The Mongols were also adept at integrating the many different peoples and cultures they encountered into their empire. Genghis Khan was a pragmatic leader who recognized that the strength of his empire would depend on his ability to unify a diverse range of peoples.
He was remarkably tolerant of the various religions, cultures, and customs of the peoples he conquered. Whether they were Buddhists, Christians, or Muslims, Genghis Khan allowed his subjects to practice their faiths freely, provided they were loyal to him. This policy of religious tolerance helped to ensure that his empire remained stable, as it avoided the kind of sectarian conflicts that had often plagued other empires. Historians still debate whether Genghis Khan's religious tolerance was a genuine reflection of his personal beliefs or whether it was a pragmatic political decision. Some scholars argue that Genghis Khan was truly interested in fostering unity and religious freedom, while others suggest that his tolerance was more a matter of political convenience. Whatever the reasons behind it, Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance helped to ensure that the Mongol Empire remained a relatively peaceful place for people of all faiths, a rarity in the medieval world. As Genghis Khan consolidated his power, he also recognized the need to secure his legacy. While he had built an empire that was unmatched in its size and power, he knew that his successors would face challenges in maintaining control over such a vast territory. He spent much of his later years ensuring that his sons and grandsons would be capable rulers, instilling in them the same values that had guided his own rise to power. Genghis Khan's death in 1227, however, marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Mongol Empire. Though his immediate successors would carry on his work, the empire would eventually fracture into different khanates, each ruled by one of Genghis Khan's descendants. Historians still debate the impact of Genghis Khan's death on the Mongol Empire. Some argue that his death marked the beginning of the empire's decline, as the lack of a strong central authority led to internal divisions and infighting among his successors. Others suggest that the empire continued to thrive for several generations after Genghis Khan's death, pointing to the continued expansion of the Mongol Empire under the leadership of his grandsons. Regardless of the debate, it is clear that Genghis Khan's death marked a turning point for the Mongol Empire, signaling the end of one era and the beginning of another. What is indisputable, however, is the enduring legacy of Genghis Khan. His empire, though it eventually fragmented, laid the groundwork for a globalized world. The cultural exchanges that took place during the Mongol Empire's reign had a lasting impact on the world, shaping the course of history in ways that continue to resonate today. The Mongols facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances, helping to create a world that was more interconnected than ever before. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's empire was ultimately a force for good or ill. Some see him as a brutal conqueror who brought devastation to vast swaths of the world, while others view him as a visionary leader who helped to shape the modern world. What is clear, however, is that Genghis Khan's impact on history cannot be overstated. His conquests, his vision of a unified empire, and his ability to govern a diverse and complex empire left an indelible mark on the course of history, one that still echoes through the centuries. As the dust settled from Genghis Khan's reign, his successors faced an empire both vast and divided. While his death in 1227 did not immediately spell the end of the Mongol Empire, the unity that Genghis Khan had forged began to fracture. The empire, sprawling across continents, was divided among his sons and grandsons, each inheriting a vast territory, yet lacking the unifying force that their grandfather had been. It was under Genghis Khan's leadership that the Mongols had reached their zenith, and in his absence, the future of the empire seemed uncertain. His eldest son, Jebe, took control of the Mongol heartland, but it was his third son, Ogedei, who would prove to be the most capable successor. Historians still debate whether Ogedei's rule truly maintained the momentum of Genghis Khan's conquests, or if it was marked by political struggles that ultimately weakened the empire. Nonetheless, Ogedei set out to consolidate the empire by carrying on Genghis Khan's policies of military expansion and centralized rule. One of Ogedei's most ambitious undertakings was the continuation of the Mongol push into Eastern Europe. The Mongols had already achieved significant victories in the region under Genghis Khan's leadership, but Ogedei sought to expand Mongol influence even further. In 1237, Mongol forces, led by Subutai and Batu, launched an invasion of the Kievan Rus, an East Slavic state that had long resisted Mongol domination. The invasion was swift and devastating,
with entire cities, like Kiev, falling to the Mongol forces. Historians still debate whether this invasion was a continuation of Genghis Khan's strategy or a more pragmatic military campaign designed to secure Mongol control over an unruly frontier. Despite the brutality of the invasion, Ogeday's military conquests were largely successful. The Kievan Rus was left in ruins, and the Mongols, under Ogeday's command, extended their rule into the heart of Eastern Europe. However, the speed and success of the conquest did not come without cost. Mongol control of the Kievan Rus would eventually lead to a new series of power struggles within the Mongol Empire itself, as various factions competed for control over the newly conquered territories. It was during this period that the Mongols began to experience the inherent instability that would ultimately lead to the fragmentation of their empire. Historians still argue whether Ogeday's campaign into Eastern Europe was an effective strategy for securing Mongol dominance, or if it simply hastened the empire's internal divisions. Some scholars believe that the Mongols could have consolidated their power in the east before pushing further into Europe, while others suggest that the expansion was essential to maintaining the empire's momentum and preserving Mongol prestige. Regardless of the debate, Ogeday's reign continued to embody many of the values Genghis Khan had championed: military prowess, territorial expansion, and the consolidation of Mongol power. However, the Mongol conquests were not limited to the east. In the west, the empire was also expanding into the Middle East. The Mongol Empire had already made its mark on Persia, and by the mid-13th century, the Mongols were advancing into the Arabian Peninsula. The 1250s saw the rise of the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state in Persia, which controlled vast territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. Under the rule of Hulagu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, the Ilkhanate's armies swept through the Middle East, toppling the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258. Historians continue to debate whether Hulagu's invasion was part of a larger Mongol strategy to extend their reach, or if it was simply the result of internal Mongol power struggles and a desire to seize control of one of the world's most valuable regions. The fall of Baghdad was a traumatic event for the Muslim world, as it marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had been a beacon of culture, knowledge, and power in the region for centuries. Hulagu's sack of Baghdad symbolized the collapse of an entire era. Historians still debate whether the Mongols' destruction of Baghdad was an inevitable result of their expansion, or if it was a tragic moment of destruction in the pursuit of Mongol dominance. Some argue that the sacking of Baghdad was an important turning point in the rise of the Ilkhanate and the spread of Mongol power, while others believe it signaled the beginning of the decline of the Mongol Empire in the Middle East. As the Mongol Empire expanded across continents, internal divisions continued to weaken it. The lack of a strong, unified leadership after the death of Genghis Khan resulted in a fragmented empire, with different Mongol Khanates acting as semi-independent states. The rivalry between Genghis Khan's descendants created tensions that would lead to the eventual disintegration of the empire. While Genghis Khan had unified the Mongols with the force of his will, his successors struggled to maintain that unity. One of the most significant internal struggles was between the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China. These two factions, ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family, competed for resources, power, and influence. The rivalry between these two khanates created a system of political fragmentation that ultimately weakened the Mongol Empire as a whole. Historians still debate whether the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire was inevitable, given its size and the challenges inherent in managing such a vast territory. Some argue that Genghis Khan's successors could have maintained the empire's unity if they had focused on preserving the centralized system of rule that Genghis Khan had established. Others believe that the internal struggles were simply the natural result of an empire that had grown too large and complex for any one ruler to maintain control over. Regardless of the cause, the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire would lead to its eventual decline, and the great empire that Genghis Khan had forged would slowly be reduced to a collection of competing khanates. Despite the internal divisions, the Mongol Empire's legacy continued to shape world history long after its fragmentation.
The cultural exchanges that occurred during the Mongol period had a profound impact on the development of civilization, especially in the fields of science, technology, and art. The Mongols helped facilitate the transfer of knowledge across vast distances, introducing innovations such as papermaking, gunpowder, and the compass to Europe. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Empire's impact was ultimately beneficial or destructive, but there is little doubt that its influence on the world was lasting and significant.
By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its zenith under the leadership of Genghis Khan's successors. Yet, as the empire began to fragment, it was clear that it was facing a transformation. Despite the division, the Mongol Khanates continued to hold immense power across much of Asia and Europe. But the centralized unity that had been the hallmark of Genghis Khan's reign was gradually slipping away. His legacy, however, endured through his progeny's leadership, and the world would see the emergence of different, yet profoundly connected, Mongol states.
The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, represented the Mongol Empire's dominion in the east. Kublai Khan's reign, starting in 1260, saw the consolidation of Mongol control over China. His imperial ambitions were vast, but they were not without resistance. The Song dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 300 years, resisted Mongol expansion fiercely. Historians still debate whether Kublai's conquest of the Song dynasty was a continuation of Genghis Khan's vision of Mongol domination, or if it was a more personal conquest of his grandfather's ideals, a desire to solidify the Mongol Empire's rule in the Middle Kingdom.
The conquest of the Song dynasty was not a quick affair. It took years of relentless military campaigns before the Mongols finally succeeded in their siege of the Song capital, Hangzhou, in 1279. But once Kublai Khan established his rule, he proved to be an adept administrator, merging Mongol military prowess with Chinese political and cultural systems. Historians still argue whether Kublai's ability to maintain a balance between Mongol and Chinese traditions was one of his greatest achievements, or whether it ultimately undermined the Mongol identity within China. What is certain, however, is that Kublai Khan's victory in China marked the peak of Mongol expansion and was a momentous achievement in Mongol history. Meanwhile, in the West, the Ilkhanate in Persia continued to expand and thrive under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. The Ilkhanate was, in many ways, the most successful of the Mongol Khanates, bringing prosperity to the region while fostering cultural exchange between the East and West. The Ilkhanate's reign, which saw the Mongols in control of much of the Iranian plateau, was marked by significant efforts to integrate local Persian customs and traditions with Mongol rule. Hulagu's military campaigns, including the infamous sack of Baghdad in 1258, demonstrated the Mongols' fearsome prowess, but the Ilkhanate also saw the rise of a sophisticated, blended culture that fused Persian, Mongol, and Islamic influences. Historians still debate whether the Mongol invasions of the Middle East and Central Asia were primarily destructive, or whether they paved the way for a renaissance of knowledge and culture. While the sack of Baghdad was catastrophic, it was also followed by a period of flourishing intellectual activity within the Ilkhanate. Scholars and artisans from across the Islamic world were welcomed in Mongol courts, and Persian art, astronomy, and science reached new heights. The Ilkhanate's patronage of intellectual pursuits made it a significant cultural hub, and its embrace of Islam saw the Mongol Empire integrate more deeply into the religious and cultural fabric of the region. The paradox of Mongol rule in Persia was that, while it was characterized by both destruction and creation, it ultimately gave rise to one of the most influential periods in Islamic history. However, despite the cultural advances of the Ilkhanate, the political situation in the Mongol Empire was becoming increasingly unstable. The unity that had defined the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan seemed to be slipping away. The fragmentation of the empire into competing khanates meant that the Mongols could no longer present the same unified force that had brought them so much success. The empire, stretched thin across vast territories, began to suffer from internal strife. as rival factions and power struggles emerged between the various Mongol princes. The once great Mongol Empire was now a loose collection of khanates, each vying for control, with no single figurehead strong enough to unify them. Historians still argue over the reasons for the Mongol Empire's decline. Some point to the internal struggles between the Mongol khanates, while others suggest that the Mongols simply had reached the limits of their empire's ability to expand. The vastness of the Mongol domain, with its diverse cultures, languages, and territories, presented an overwhelming challenge for any ruler to govern effectively. Others believe that the Mongol Empire's decline was inevitable, as the nomadic Mongol way of life was ill-suited to ruling vast settled civilizations. The transition from a steppe-based warrior society to a more sedentary empire required adaptations that, over time, the Mongols were unable to make successfully. As the 14th century began, the Mongol Empire's fragmentation became more pronounced. While Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty held firm control over China, the Ilkhanate in Persia was beginning to crumble. The Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that ruled much of Russia, was also in decline, struggling with internal power struggles and external threats. The rise of new empires, such as the Russian state and the Ottoman Empire, signaled the end of Mongol dominance in the region. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Genghis Khan and the Mongols was far from forgotten. The Mongols had changed the course of history, influencing everything from military strategy to cultural exchange. Their conquests had opened up the world in ways never before imagined, and their influence on global trade, the spread of ideas, and the exchange of cultures continued to resonate long after the empire's fragmentation. Historians still debate the impact of the Mongols on the world. Some argue that the Mongols' brutal conquests left a legacy of destruction and suffering, while others point to the immense cultural and intellectual exchanges that were facilitated by the Mongol Empire. The reality is likely somewhere in between. The Mongols were responsible for both immense destruction and lasting cultural contributions. Their empire had the unique ability to link distant civilizations and to spread knowledge, technologies, and religions across vast distances. The Mongols may have fractured, but their influence continued to shape the world for centuries to come. As the Mongol Empire continued to fragment throughout the 14th century, the legacy of Genghis Khan's descendants remained both vibrant and complex. By this point, the Mongols had transformed the political landscape of Asia, but with the weakening of central control, their empire slowly morphed into a series of autonomous khanates, each with its own fate. The Mongols, who had once united such vast stretches of land, were now divided into competing realms. And though their influence was far-reaching, their unity was gone. In the Yuan dynasty of China, the Mongol rule continued to endure, but it faced growing resistance from the native Han Chinese population. By the mid-14th century, dissatisfaction with Mongol rule had reached a boiling point. The Mongols, while able administrators in many ways, were also seen as foreign rulers who imposed high taxes and favored Mongol elites over the native Chinese. Rebellions began to spread across the country, with one of the most significant being the Red Turban Rebellion in 1351. Historians still argue over whether the Mongols' downfall in China was inevitable or whether they might have overcome these challenges with different leadership. Some suggest that the Mongols' inability to connect fully with the local population contributed to their downfall, while others argue that the social and economic conditions were simply too ripe for rebellion. By 1368, the Ming dynasty emerged as the new force in China, overthrowing the Yuan dynasty and effectively ending Mongol rule in the region. Kublai Khan's descendants, though still holding power in the Mongol court, saw their grip on China slip away. The rise of the Ming dynasty was a pivotal moment in Chinese history, as it represented a return to native rule and the beginning of an era of great prosperity and cultural growth. The fall of the Yuan dynasty was one of the final blows to the Mongol Empire, marking the end of the last truly unified Mongol state. Meanwhile, in Persia, the Ilkhanate's decline was equally tumultuous. After the death of Hulagu Khan in 1265, the Ilkhanate slowly lost its cohesion, weakened by internal feuds and external pressures.
The Mongols who had once ruled the vast Iranian plateau struggled with succession disputes, and by the early 14th century, the Ilkhanate was no more. Historians still debate whether the collapse of the Ilkhanate was due to the Mongols' inability to integrate fully into Persian society, or whether the turbulent political landscape of the region was simply too volatile for any foreign dynasty to maintain power for long. The region was eventually overtaken by local Persian rulers, and while Mongol influence lingered, it was no longer the dominant force it had once been. In the steppes, the Golden Horde, which had once controlled much of Russia, began to experience similar challenges. Internal divisions, as well as pressure from the rising power of Moscow, led to the decline of Mongol power in the region. By the late 14th century, the Grand Duchy of Moscow had gained significant autonomy from the Golden Horde, marking the beginning of Russia's rise as a regional power. Historians still debate whether the decline of the Golden Horde was due to the Mongols' internal political struggles, or whether it was more the result of the Russian state's growing strength and unity. Regardless, the collapse of Mongol power in Russia paved the way for the formation of the Russian Empire in the centuries to come. One of the more unexpected developments during this period was the influence the Mongols had on Europe, particularly in terms of military tactics and trade. The Mongol invasions, while devastating, also introduced European powers to new technologies and strategies, particularly in the realm of cavalry and siege warfare. Historians still argue about the extent of the Mongols' impact on European military tactics, with some suggesting that their methods were adopted by European armies, while others believe the Mongols had a more indirect influence. However, one thing is certain: the Mongol invasions left a mark on Europe, not just in the form of destruction, but also through the exchange of knowledge and military innovations. The Mongols' influence on trade and the exchange of goods was perhaps their most enduring legacy. Despite the fragmentation of their empire, the Mongol Khanates continued to play a key role in global trade. The Silk Roads, though no longer under a single Mongol banner, remained a crucial network of exchange between the East and the West. The Mongol Empire's connections to the vast trade networks stretching from China to the Mediterranean ensured that goods, technologies, and ideas continued to flow across Eurasia. Historians still debate whether the Silk Roads would have been as prosperous without the unifying influence of the Mongols, with some arguing that the empire's collapse led to a decline in trade, while others suggest that the spirit of interconnectedness created by the Mongols lived on in the later centuries. By the 15th century, the Mongol Khanates had fractured further, and the world they had created was no longer recognizable. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the West, the resurgence of Chinese power under the Ming Dynasty, and the consolidation of power in Russia all marked the end of the Mongols' dominance in Eurasia. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan and his descendants was far from gone. Their contributions to trade, culture, and the exchange of ideas had a lasting impact on the development of civilizations across the globe. Historians still argue about the ultimate impact of the Mongols. Some view them as a destructive force, while others see them as a unifying power that brought cultures together. What is clear, however, is that the Mongol Empire, despite its fragmentation and decline, shaped the course of history in profound ways. The influence of Genghis Khan and his descendants can still be seen in the modern world, in everything from global trade networks to the cultural exchanges that continue to shape our lives today. As the 15th century began, the echoes of the Mongol Empire were still felt across Eurasia, but a new world was beginning to take shape. The rise of the Ottomans in the west, the expansion of the Russian Empire to the north, and the flourishing of the Ming Dynasty in the east marked the dawning of a new era. The Mongol legacy, however, was not easily forgotten. Despite the fall of their unified empire, the Mongols' influence persisted in various forms across the lands they once controlled. In Central Asia, the steppe was no longer under Mongol dominance, but the memory of their rule lingered in the customs and traditions of the people. The nomadic tribes, which had once served as intermediaries between the East and West, continued to play a key role in the trade and cultural exchange that was the hallmark of the Silk Roads. The Mongols had paved the way for the flourishing of trade, and their connections to the vast networks of commerce that spanned across continents were still in place. Central Asia, once the beating heart of the Mongol Empire, remained a crossroads for merchants and travelers. Despite the fragmentation of the Mongol Khanates, the spirit of trade and exchange that Genghis Khan had fostered continued to thrive. Historians still argue about the extent of the Mongols' role in shaping the future of Central Asia. Some believe that their downfall in the region left a power vacuum that allowed for the rise of new empires, while others suggest that the Mongols had laid the foundations for the prosperity of the region by establishing trade routes and facilitating the movement of goods and ideas. Regardless of the specifics, what is clear is that the Mongol legacy in Central Asia was far from over. The region continued to be a hub of cultural exchange, with merchants from all over the world passing through, bringing with them new technologies, ideas, and goods. In China, the Ming dynasty had emerged victorious after the fall of the Yuan dynasty, and the Mongol presence in the country had diminished significantly. However, the legacy of the Mongols remained deeply ingrained in Chinese society. The Mongols had introduced a new era of trade and exchange, and under the Ming rulers, China continued to be a major player in global commerce. The Silk Roads, though no longer controlled by the Mongols, remained an important avenue for trade, and the Ming dynasty continued to engage in diplomatic relations with neighboring empires and kingdoms. The Mongol legacy in China was not one of conquest, but of cultural and economic exchange, which the Ming rulers recognized and sought to maintain. Historians still debate the impact of the Mongols on Chinese society. Some argue that their rule brought stability and prosperity, while others believe that the Mongols were a disruptive force that imposed foreign customs and practices on the Chinese people. Regardless of these differing perspectives, it is clear that the Mongols had a profound impact on the course of Chinese history. The Mongol Empire's influence on China was not limited to the political realm. It extended to the cultural and economic spheres as well. The exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas between East and West continued to thrive under the Ming dynasty, and the Mongols' role in fostering these connections could not be denied. To the north, in Russia, the Mongol influence remained a significant force. The Golden Horde, which had once ruled over the vast Russian steppes, had lost much of its power, but the impact of Mongol rule was still felt in the Russian political and military systems. The Mongols had introduced new military tactics and organizational structures that were adopted by the Russian princes, and their influence on the Russian economy and trade networks remained strong. While the Mongols no longer controlled the region, their legacy had shaped the development of the Russian state. Historians continue to debate the nature of the Mongol influence on Russia. Some argue that the Mongols played a key role in the formation of the Russian state by providing the political structure and military organization that allowed the Russian princes to consolidate power. Others believe that the Mongols' influence was more limited, and that Russia would have eventually emerged as a powerful state without their intervention. Regardless of the debate, it is clear that the Mongols left their mark on Russia, both in terms of political organization and military strategy. One of the most enduring aspects of the Mongol legacy was their impact on the trade networks that spanned across Eurasia. The Mongols had created a vast network of trade routes that connected the east to the west, and despite the fragmentation of their empire, these routes continued to be a vital part of global commerce. The Silk Roads, though no longer controlled by the Mongols, remained an important avenue for the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. The Mongols had fostered a climate of exchange and cooperation that endured long after their empire had crumbled. Historians still argue about the significance of the Mongols in the development of global trade. Some believe that the Mongols were the driving force behind the growth of the Silk Roads, while others argue that trade would have flourished regardless of Mongol involvement. What is clear is that the Mongols played a key role in facilitating the movement of goods and ideas across Eurasia. The Mongols, with their network of roads, their protection of trade routes, and their encouragement of cultural exchange, laid the foundations for the global trade networks that would emerge in the centuries to come. By the 15th century, the world had changed dramatically. The Mongol Empire was no longer a unified force, but its legacy remained. The trade routes they had established continued to facilitate the exchange of goods and ideas, and the cultures they had brought together continued to influence one another. While the Mongol Empire had fragmented, its impact on the world was far from over. The spirit of Genghis Khan's conquests, the desire to connect the world through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, lived on in the interactions between East and West, and in the trade networks that continued to link distant civilizations. As the centuries passed, the Mongol Empire faded into history, but the ideas, technologies, and cultural exchanges that it had fostered continued to shape the world. The Mongols, despite their violent conquests and eventual fragmentation, had created a legacy that transcended their empire. Their contributions to global trade, military strategy, and cultural exchange were felt for centuries, and the world they had helped shape continued to evolve long after their empire had fallen. Historians still debate the true nature of the Mongols' legacy. Were they a force for good, uniting disparate cultures and facilitating the exchange of ideas? Or were they a destructive force, sowing chaos and destruction across Eurasia? The answer, as with most historical questions, is complex. The Mongols were both conquerors and connectors, destroying old systems while creating new ones. Their empire may have fallen, but the impact of Genghis Khan and his descendants continues to be felt today. As the 16th century began to unfold, the influence of the Mongols had largely waned, but their legacy was far from forgotten. The world was entering an age of exploration, where maritime trade was gradually overtaking the ancient land routes. However, the legacy of the Silk Roads, which had been shaped by Mongol control, still reverberated across the globe, connecting distant regions in ways never seen before. The trade networks that the Mongols had helped establish would become a fundamental part of the world's expanding economies, though the routes themselves would no longer be defined by the Mongol Empire. In China, the Ming dynasty had risen to power, consolidating control over the vast territory the Mongols had once ruled. Though the Mongols had been ousted, many of their practices and innovations continued to shape Chinese society. The Mongols, particularly through their patronage of trade, had opened China up to the outside world, and the Ming rulers, while more insular, continued to engage in trade with foreign nations. The global influence of the Silk Roads, forged under the Mongol Empire, would continue to be felt as Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea became highly prized commodities in international markets. Historians still debate the extent to which the Ming dynasty's foreign policy was influenced by the legacy of Mongol rule. Some argue that the Ming rulers, wary of foreign influence, sought to close the country off from the outside world, while others believe that the Mongol established trade routes played a significant role in sustaining China's commercial prosperity. Either way, the world that the Mongols had helped to connect would continue to thrive in new forms, though the Mongols themselves were no longer the central players. Across the sea, in the Ottoman Empire, the rise of a new trade network was well underway. The Ottomans, having absorbed much of the Byzantine Empire's territory, stood at the crossroads between East and West, controlling critical trade routes between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Their control over key Mediterranean ports like Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, and their dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean ensured that they would play a pivotal role in global trade. The Ottomans did not control the Silk Roads in the same way the Mongols had, but they were the inheritors of the global trade network that the Mongols had helped to establish. Historians still debate the significance of the Ottoman Empire's role in continuing the legacy of the Silk Roads. Some argue that the Ottomans, by facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas between East and West, were the true successors to the Mongols, maintaining the flow of commerce across the world. Others believed that the Ottomans were more concerned with regional dominance, and that their contributions to the Silk Roads were more about military and political control than fostering the cultural exchange that had characterized the earlier Mongol period. Nevertheless, it is clear that the Ottomans, by controlling the routes through the Middle East, ensured that trade continued to flourish. Though their empire was different from the Mongol Empire in both scope and character. To the north, the Russian Empire was beginning its expansion eastward,
pushing into Siberia and across the vast stretches of the Russian steppe. While the Mongols had once controlled these lands, the Russian Empire was now asserting its dominance over the region. Russian traders, explorers, and settlers followed in the footsteps of the Mongols, seeking to extend Russia's reach into Central Asia, the very heart of the Silk Roads. The rise of Russia was not just about territorial expansion. It was about connecting the Eurasian landmass once again through trade, just as the Mongols had done centuries earlier. Historians continue to debate whether Russia's expansion into Central Asia was a natural continuation of the Mongol legacy, or whether it represented a break from the past. Some argue that Russia's expansion was a direct response to the political instability left by the Mongols, while others believe that the Russian Empire was simply taking advantage of a power vacuum in the region. What is certain, however, is that Russia's control over Central Asia helped preserve the commercial links between the East and the West, even as the Mongol Empire faded into history. Russian traders continued to make their way across the Central Asian steppe, carrying goods like furs, precious metals, and grain between Europe and Asia. As the world moved toward the 18th century, the legacy of the Mongols continued to shape the political and cultural landscape of Eurasia. The Silk Roads, though no longer a unified network, continued to serve as a conduit for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. The Mongols, through their conquests, had united a vast and diverse region, and the trade routes they had established remained critical to global commerce. While the Mongol Empire itself was long gone, the world they helped to connect was more interconnected than ever before. Historians still debate the role of the Mongols in shaping the global economy. Some argue that their conquest helped create the foundation for the modern world economy, while others suggest that their role was more incidental, with the development of trade networks being driven by other forces. Regardless of these debates, it is clear that the Mongols had a profound impact on the course of world history, and their legacy continues to resonate in the global systems of trade and communication that have shaped the modern world. The Mongols may have fallen from power, but their legacy, like the Silk Roads themselves, continues to echo through history. Their contributions to global trade, military strategy, and cultural exchange cannot be overstated. As the world moved into the 18th century, the forces of globalization began to take shape, and the foundations laid by the Mongols would continue to influence the world for centuries to come. By the 19th century, the once vital Silk Roads had largely lost their dominance in global trade, eclipsed by the rise of maritime routes and the growing power of European empires. The great caravanserais that had once dotted the Central Asian steppe now stood abandoned, remnants of a time when the overland trade routes were the lifeblood of commerce between East and West. Yet, despite their decline, the legacy of the Silk Roads remained alive in the shared history of the nations that had once thrived along them. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Europe during the late 18th century, shifted the focus of global trade from overland routes to the vast networks of sea routes now controlled by powerful maritime nations. The expansion of European empires, first by the British, then the French, Spanish, and Portuguese, ushered in an era of global trade via the seas. With the development of steamships, railroads, and new technologies, the world was now more interconnected than ever before, though in a different way than the ancient Silk Roads had been. Historians still debate the extent to which the decline of the Silk Roads was inevitable in the face of industrialization and the growth of maritime trade. Some argue that, even without the technological advances of the 19th century, the rise of European colonial powers would have led to the decline of the overland trade routes. Others suggest that, had the empires along the Silk Roads managed to modernize and adapt, the ancient routes could have remained a significant part of global trade. Regardless of the debates, the fact remains that the world's trade routes were now more focused on the seas than the land, and the Silk Roads were no longer the central arteries of commerce. However, the spirit of the Silk Roads never truly vanished. The ideas, technologies, and cultures that had once flowed along these ancient routes continued to shape the world. The exchange of goods and ideas between East and West, which had started with the Mongols and their predecessors, was now taking place in a new form. The spread of industrial technology, new philosophies, and scientific knowledge during the 19th century was, in many ways, an extension of the cultural exchanges that had taken place along the Silk Roads centuries earlier. One of the most notable continuations of the Silk Road's legacy was the spread of ideas. The 19th century saw the rise of new intellectual movements, including the spread of socialism, liberalism, and nationalism, many of which were heavily influenced by the ideas that had crossed the ancient trade routes. Philosophies and religious beliefs, including Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, continued to spread along new routes as people traveled between the East and the West. The fusion of Eastern and Western philosophies, which had begun along the Silk Roads, now found new expressions in the global exchange of ideas. While the ancient Silk Roads had been primarily focused on the movement of goods, the 19th century marked a shift toward the movement of knowledge and technology. The industrialized nations of Europe and North America, which had gained tremendous economic and technological advantages during the Industrial Revolution, began to export their innovations to the rest of the world. As nations in Asia and Africa began to modernize, the flow of knowledge, technology, and industrial expertise mirrored the exchanges that had once taken place along the Silk Roads.
In the midst of this transformation, the modern Silk Roads were also beginning to take shape in a new form.
The rise of railroads, steamships, and later, the advent of air travel meant that the world was again becoming more interconnected. Though the land routes were no longer the primary means of trade, the connections between East and West remained strong. The exchange of goods continued, albeit through different channels, and the global economy continued to grow in ways that were unimaginable during the days of the ancient trade routes. Despite the dominance of maritime trade, the land routes that had once defined the Silk Roads were not entirely forgotten. The 19th century saw the beginning of efforts to revive the ancient trade routes, particularly in the form of railroads and modern infrastructure. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, for example, was a modern-day attempt to reconnect the regions of Central Asia with Europe. This massive engineering project, completed in the early 20th century, re-established the land bridge between East and West that had existed centuries before, though now with modern trains replacing the caravans of old. Historians still debate whether this revival of the Silk Roads was a conscious effort to bring back the old trade routes, or if it was simply the result of industrial progress. Some argue that the expansion of railroads and the rise of global commerce were a natural evolution of the Silk Roads, while others suggest that the renewed interest in these routes was a nostalgic longing for the golden age of the ancient trade routes. Regardless of the motivations, the revival of these trade routes in the form of railroads and modern infrastructure marked a new chapter in the history of the Silk Roads. By the 20th century, the influence of the Silk Roads had spread far beyond the regions they had once traversed. The global system of trade and exchange that had begun with the ancient routes had grown into a vast interconnected world economy. Goods, ideas, and technologies now flowed freely across the globe, facilitated by modern transportation and communication networks. The ancient Silk Roads, though no longer a central hub of trade, had laid the foundation for the modern world, and their legacy continued to shape the global economy. Historians still argue whether the modern world's interconnectedness is truly a continuation of the Silk Roads, or whether it represents a break from the past. Some believe that the modern economy is a direct descendant of the Silk Road's spirit of global exchange, while others argue that the rise of global capitalism and imperialism has led to a more exploitative system of trade. Either way, the world today is undeniably shaped by the same principles of exchange, communication, and cultural interaction that defined the ancient Silk Roads. As you sit back and reflect on the long journey of the Silk Roads, you realize that their story is far from over. Though the ancient trade routes have faded into history, their legacy continues to live on in the interconnected world we inhabit today. The exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures that once took place along the Silk Roads still shapes the way we live, work, and connect with one another. The spirit of the Silk Roads, the spirit of exchange and collaboration, lives on in the global networks that link us all.